This week, we welcome Padraic O'Reilly, co-founder and chief product officer at Cybersaint, to discuss transforming cyber risk and compliance through automation. In the leadership and communications section, Paul, Jason, and I share our lessons learned from 2020 and changes we see coming in 2021. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Deepwatch provides innovative managed security services that empower organizations to be more resilient against today's evolving cyber threats. Deepwatch offers game-changing capabilities in managed detection and response, managed endpoint detection and response, and vulnerability management, all delivered through a unique squad model, a dedicated group of security experts that works directly with each client. From managed security operations to threat hunting to continuous measurement of security readiness, Deepwatch is advancing the service of managed security. Measure your SecOps maturity for free by visiting securityweekly.com/Deepwatch. Most breaches are caused by exploiting oversights in basic cybersecurity fundamentals, but complex hybrid multi-cloud infrastructures make cybersecurity hygiene challenging. Red Seal can help. It shows you what's on your network, how it's connected, and the associated risk across public cloud, private cloud, and physical environments. With Red Seal, you'll get control of your cybersecurity fundamentals so you can protect your organization from the inevitable attack vectors and reduce your cyber risk. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/Red Seal. As a security leader, Cyber for Teams was built to make your job easier. Are you struggling to measure your team's skills proficiency, provide critical or relevant role-based training, or translate training investments into meaningful business outcomes? Cyber for Teams is the industry's #1 NIST-aligned DoD 8140 and 8570 compliance certification and skills training platform. 96% of the Fortune 500 have employees training on Cyber. Cyber for Teams. Skills development solved. Visit cyber.it/solved to solve your training problems.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 200, recorded December 14th, 2020. I am your host, Matt Alderman, here in a snowy Colorado. Joining me from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island is my first co-host, Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Thanks, Matt. It's good to be here on episode 200, where I now have the difference between Red Seal and Red Canary, which I messed up last week. I don't know if you caught that, Matt. It was really embarrassing, though. I feel like they both deserve a little more airtime. They are two totally different and totally awesome companies.
Yes, two very different solutions, companies. Paul. Yes. And joining us on the lines is my second co-host, Mr. Jason Albuquerque.
Hey, Matt. Hey, Paul. Great to be here. Episode 200, outstanding. When we come back from the new year, I'll be around 100 episodes, so I can't wait for that one. 201, baby.
Woohoo! There we go. Jason, you've been almost on as long as I have, Jason, so watch out.
Aspirations, buddy, aspirations.
Yes. Do you always end up missing our live streams? Need somewhere to flag Security Weekly podcasts that you want to listen to? Subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel. Sign up for our mailing list and join our Discord server to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe. This segment is sponsored by Cybersaint. To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/Cybersaint BSW. Padraic O'Reilly is Chief Product Officer and co-founder at Cybersaint, where he leads the product innovation and development for the company. His experience as a Harvard-trained economist, IT risk and compliance consultant, and his early exposure to cybersecurity led him to co-found Cybersaint and develop an award-winning patented platform used by some of the most recognizable companies in the world to automate cyber and IT risk and compliance management at scale. Padraic, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, I love this topic because some of the people know I spent a good portion of my career in governance, risk management, and compliance, having built one of the early platforms. And I want to give this little story because I think it's interesting to kind of the thought process behind Cybersaint. When we built GRC back in the day, I was running third-party vendor management for one of the top 10 banks in the country. And I had 70,000 vendors, and I had to run third-party vendor assessments across these 70,000 vendors. And it was Excel spreadsheets and email, and you know the story, right? And so we set out to build a system that could help us automate steps in the process. And we did. We built a product called Control Path and was in the space for a while. But there's one fundamental flaw I made in the early design of the platform. The assumption was only 20% or so of the controls that you have to assess are technical in nature. The rest were management and operational controls, and we used questionnaires to collect all the data.
Right.
But what that basic assumption did was really limited the scalability of the early GRC platforms, in that when you took that 20% of controls, but then you scaled it out to thousands or hundreds of thousands of assets, you ran into a pretty big technological challenge. That's where I want to start the conversation, Patrick, because you saw that somewhere in your history, which led to Cybersaint, I think.
Yeah, it did, because early days we did start trying to just run controls on various assessments, and that's what we do. That's what the software started to do. That was the first version of the product, and quickly we ran into the problem you're talking about, which is kind of more of a multi-tenancy, and how do you treat controls over time, and how do you make it scalable? So we had to change the data model in the rebuild. And that's what we did. We tweaked the data model. And now a lot of what we're doing still relates to the problem you described, which is how do you get data into a multi-tenant environment with different tags, different operating units, business units, applications, et cetera, and do that in a granular way and configure those controls. So we don't want to ignore those technical controls. We do have the questionnaire-based version inside system. We're flexible. So we have always built to be maximally flexible, because we knew that the use cases were going to keep coming and they were going to be different. So we try to solve for the most use cases as possible.
Yeah, and it's the data model that I think is the interesting part you really had to focus some time on, because we had a lot of flexibility in a control path, but I was a MySQL backend, and I could only do so much in a relational database. Then you had somebody like Archer who built a metadata model on top of a SQL Server database. And you want to talk about limitation of scale. That was the best way to do it. So how did you solve the basic fundamental data architecture to give you the flexibility you needed in the data model, in the design of how all these pieces come together, but also keep scale available? Because that's really the challenge.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to give some credit to my chief developer, Scott Shidlovsky, because he came in just after we changed the data model, and he wanted to get us on a more classical design. And I think what we have used metadata, in fact, to classify assessments. So we really view things kind of, hierarchically, like framework, assessment, controls, and the like. And we're going at both ends now with the data model. So, we have to have ways to classify assessments, because a lot of the companies we're working with, they're integrating into, like, say, Tenable, for example. They port data across tag structures, so group and type tag structures. It's very important to have that extensibility in the data model. And then at the bottom, at the control level, it turns out that with integration into CMDBs, you have to allow controls to have configuration now. So they have to have, effectively the capability to eat spreadsheets, controls, individual controls now. So it's we have a very flexible sort of fundamental theorem, and it's extensible from top to bottom.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the challenges in this space, because no two organizations have the same asset structure, and no two organizations have the same control structure.
They don't. And you have to be sort of, always doing a certain kind of mathematics to get, as mathematicians would say, the most general case.
Right, exactly right. So when we think about deployments, give us some ideas. Where do customers start? I mean, there is a journey to
Yeah.
building out a governance, risk management, and compliance
Huge.
program, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of walk us through, what does that look like for Cybersaint customers? Where do they start? What are some of the big use cases where they're leveraging the automation you can bring to the table to solve some of their problems?
Yeah. Well, it starts with, learning how they've done assessments historically, right? They usually come to us after they've hit a brick wall of sorts, but there's a lot of good material there, so they usually have some way of classifying their assets. They usually have some kind of cadence they've been on with respect to assessments. They usually have, some audit requirements. They have frameworks, they have standards they use. So with the bigger customers, and I guess that would be, because we work with a lot of the Fortune 500, they might start out with a couple of fundamental frameworks that they've taken and sort of maybe run into a bit of a brick wall in some legacy GRC. And what they really want to do is get moving with sort of, the multi-tenant and then one pane of glass aspect of our platform very quickly. So they'll give us big frameworks they've been working with for a long time. Some of them are very custom. So the data model had to adapt to that too, because companies that are mature often have, a version of the CSF that might have, 2 additional dimensions on the framework functions. It might have, 40 additional subcategories. They might have a 900 control environment that they've mapped into the CSF. So, showing them that we can quickly, satisfy that. And then we start to build out the, asset structure or the business org structure across it. One of the largest use cases we have, several thousand assessments, and it's all site-based. So we had to have, the tag structure had to support, we're in, say, Texas, and now we're in this county, and now we're at this kind of site, and, we're looking at this kind of operation inside the site. So it's a cascading hierarchical thing. So, I would say that, I'm surprised at how quickly we get it done with some of the larger companies because they do have some unique approaches to things. But we like to be able to support that if we can, because it gives them the confidence that we're going to be able to support their longer term goals as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, getting that asset structure in, mapping out the controls, two huge barriers for most organizations. I remember the days when I was at the bank, I used to have to go into the general ledger system just to pull like the business hierarchy because it wasn't stored anywhere else except for finance had it in the GL, right?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, we deal with the same basic issues. And the thing is, you don't want it's a real opportunity because this is where the legacy platforms fall down a bit. So, if we can solve these things in a nimble way, we have a very good opportunity to keep working with these organizations, which is exciting.
Yeah. Now let's talk. I heard a question back there. I'm going to stop for a
No,
second.
I was just going to kind of throw in there. I mean, from an organization like ours, we not only have our internal control sets that we need to make sure we're adhering to. We have 6,000 customers, right? So at the end of the day, as a managed service provider, IT services organization, our customers want to know from their vendor risk management perspective that we're adhering to their authority documents. So, we have a central pillar of NIST 853, but we try to map back 19 different authority documents for our customers for us to be able to show adherence to their control sets as a service provider, right? So that's a place that can be a struggle sometimes. So I'm interested in hearing on how you can, in that multi-tenant environment that you're mentioning, how you can architect something like that for us, right? It's not necessarily our internal operational requirements, but it's something that we have to show our customers.
Yeah, you've got to report out on some standard that you're not necessarily you're using 853. Good choice, by the way. It's the deepest pool, I think. And if you are going to start propagating data into other environments and other regulatory structures and controls, 853 is excellent for that because it's so granular. We've solved that in a lot of different ways over time. At first, it was iterative. At first, it was crosswalking between standards that were related. So, like say DFARS or Handbook 162 and NIST 853. Sort of parent-child relations. So, in our data model, yet again to reference our data model, we we associate controls and control IDs and control actions with each other. So I think, the way we're solving it now is we actually have, researchers on staff along with me who are, building natural language processing to do much more granular analysis of some of these mappings. So if you look at a classic mapping like 853 into the sys controls and the sys subcontrols, it's not that granular. It's sort of like, it's like if you use the analogy of GPS, it would be like you're pointing at a county and not a house, right? If you actually look at a control like AC2, it's got 16 line items on it, right? Well, where do all those line items go into the sys controls, onto the subcontrols? Those mappings don't really exist. That's what we're trying to solve now. So we've built some algorithms to solve that. That said, we do crosswalking all the time behind the scenes, and now we're building out the UI around crosswalking so that teams can stop having to maybe run to the UCF, that huge paywall that's put up around it in the authority documents. We're trying to solve this at scale in a more exact, precise way, leveraging NLP, because it's really a candidate problem for NLP.
Yeah.
And large organizations are coming to us on this. They're like, we've got this crazy control set that we've used for years, and we don't even know how it projects across these 20 regulations. So this is a huge opportunity to do this.
Padraic,
Jason,
I had a question, just more of a basic question, right? Obviously, Matt and Jason spend a lot more time in this area than I do, for sure. Where does the baseline come from, right? What I hear you talking about collectively is that we like to have a baseline that we compare to different compliance standards. Maybe some of those are our own internal standards that we've set. Some of them are external standards that we have to be in compliance to or want to be in compliance to. Obviously, there's a difference. Where do most of your customers get that baseline from? I'm assuming it's a combination of things, right?
Yeah, it depends on the sector. So like, for example, the energy, sector, they're old and mature, and they're really protecting against certain types of terrible attacks. So they have the government watching them, right? Mm-hmm. So they have NERC-CIP they're working with. They often work with the big four. So they might be running a version of the cybersecurity framework that's diagnostic. They might have their own internal IT controls as well. But then you look at other industries like education, that's more, they're pulling some of these standards out of best practices, so they've read up on NIST and they want to get compliant on NIST 853, and it's sort of an in-house project. Banking, totally different. Banking's got to be compliant with Office of the Comptroller, the SEC, certain Chinese regulations. It goes on and on the list. One of the best of practice approaches for baselining yourself is to do what Matt was talking about, which is to grab 853, baseline yourself on that. And there's a lot of, efficiencies you can get out of 853 into other control environments.
Padraic, where do the data sources come to see if you're compliant with those? Are they questionnaires primarily? Is it scanned data, combination?
It's a combination. So with the vision with automation that we're working on now is you could pull in data from all sorts of your whole stack. You could pull it in from your identity and access management system. You could pull it in from your global policy objects. You could pull it in from your vulnerability scan, behavioral analytics, and the list goes on and on. So the real pie in the sky vision that we have is and we're doing it now, is to pull actual data in onto controls and automate the controls where you can, and then have the human review where you still need it, which you will in some spots. Like, do you have, logs for people visiting your facilities? Do you have desks? Do you have key card stuff? There's certain answers, you can't automate unless you can, reach into someone's head, which is not quite yet possible.
How often are folks iterating on that automation?
Automation, I think in our space was, something that was talked about in 2018 to some extent, and COVID has really sort of forced the larger companies' hands a little bit on it, because the workforce is virtualizing and they're moving to the cloud, and they see an opportunity now to pull data in a more automated manner. And I think automation was always the dream. You had companies claiming 4 or 5 years ago that they were going to automate control assessments. Turns out they couldn't quite pull it off. It wasn't in their wheelhouse. So some of the companies that initially claimed to do automation weren't really interested in diving into the controls and establishing how does this kind of identity and access management data map specifically to controls and components of controls. It's a bit of work. We got into it because we were interested in taking vulnerability data and threat data and mapping to controls. So that's how we started. So, now it's much more possible because, it's the time is right and companies are willing to invest the time in it.
I think it's so important though, because like, I want to know, all right, we've created a policy that says we will have multi-factor authentication. And like one day we don't. And I mean, that control can fall off in a number of different ways, but also how you test for that. Maybe that's not your vulnerability scanner in my experience, right? That's something else. How do we keep tabs on stuff like that? Like once we've set policy, especially compliance policy, I want to know if we're out of compliance. That's a huge issue.
Huge. Yeah, agreed. And we're doing a lot of that right now. So
gotcha. Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, just to explain how not simple his statement was. I did this for 5.5 years, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to say that I can pull in vulnerability scan results is no small task.
No.
No, I just some of the scale I think people need to understand.
Yeah.
I remember when we were doing the due diligence when we got acquired by TrustWave, Qualys was the other acquirer. And I remember Philippe and the team coming in and say, okay, how do you render 500,000 assets? That was like a really interesting question. And I saw Sean Malloy's head just spinning like, okay, I can do it, right? And he would do it. But it's not just that. It's 500,000 assets. Now tie 100 plus vulnerabilities to every single one of those assets and do the math. We're talking billions of records that need to be correlated in these systems. And so this was always the challenge, Padraic, right? I mean, how do you bring in billions of records and be able to run them through these various checks and roll them back up to your control standards, see if you're in compliance or not? That is no small task.
No, it's not. It's not. And if it weren't for having, some NLP, we wouldn't be able to look at the more dynamic data that's coming out of vulnerability assessments. So, the full dream of, having every asset associated with its unique controls and then having vulnerability data spreading across it is, it's a very large challenge because there's a lot of logic involved. And, we've had to put our thinking caps on occasion.
Yeah.
And now, guys, couple that with all the information you need to collect from the bane of my existence, which I'll call vendor risk management. Right? I mean, that's a whole other piece that we have to manage on our side, our hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of vendors, where ultimately someday I see the nirvana of my Cybersaint tenant and their Cybersaint tenant having some level of API connection or connectivity where they could feed me the information so I don't have to go through these arduous assessments.
Yes. Yeah. And vendor risk management has come on our radar, especially, this year. So, a lot of the companies we're working with that are, part of the onboarding process is they're also spinning up a vendor risk management program at the same time. And they like our product because it's so intuitive. So when they, ask their vendors to answer questionnaires, they like to leverage us because it's very simple. They can just come in, be, located on the specific assessment that they're assigned to, do the work, and you have the visibility. Reporting out on your vendor risk as well. We're trying to make that as simple as possible.
Yeah, I mean, your scale there, Jason, is 6,000 vendors, 1,100 questions on a standard information gathering form, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, if they even understand what we do, right? I mean, that's the problem is in many cases, customers come at us with the highest risk assessment possible because they don't quite understand that as a managed service provider, we're not processing their data. Right. We're not storing their data, things of that nature. So I think part of the issue is, and I found that with my team, we're better off having a conversation before they even send us the assessment so they can better understand what we do so they can limit the scope.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So Patrick, we got all this data, right? We got our
Yeah.
assets in, we got our
Mhm.
controls in, we're
Yep.
starting to do some automation on the control validation. How does this then roll up to the business, to the board of directors?
Right.
How is risk being delivered on a more real-time basis? Because I think that's the nirvana state, right?
It is.
Is if I can automate the collection of this data,
Right.
I can see changes in risk in a real-time way and be
Exactly.
able to educate the executives and the board.
Exactly. And that is really the nirvana or the holy grail or whatever you want to call it. We started out running risk assessments that were very simple. They were 830 based, out of NIST. So they leveraged, likelihood and impact, and they were at the level of control failure for a while. Because our first clients were just sort of running control environments, and their risk assessments were just based on the control sets. We had to pivot and build in a risk register because our largest clients were saying, "Hey, how do we have the conversation in the boardroom? I don't want to be on a control. I don't want to look at the control data. We don't want to be surfing through the terabytes of data or whatever and look at it. We don't really even want to hear much IT language. What we want to hear about is return on investment and CapEx and OpEx, and we want to look at gaps." And we want to analyze what to do. And we want to be able to look across different classifications of our business units or our assets and see patterns as well, and then make decisions based on those patterns. So that was what we had to solve. And we, early last year, we got the new risk register into the platform. We got what we call solution cost modeling into the platform as well, which is the ability to identify gaps, do the analytics across different, however you slice and dice your assets or risks or applications or sites, and then actually game out solutions for it using costing. So we try to be as flexible as possible. We have 830 as a risk model. We have a simple risk model. We have the fair model coming. So we want to be risk model agnostic, but we're inside some of those conversations in the boardroom, and we take it seriously. We want to arm security professionals with the best data and the best presentation of data that they can have possible to make the case upstairs, because there are two cultures. There are more than two cultures, but when you're talking about the board or the C-suite talking to the security team, you have to bridge the gap. And the metrics are generally dollars and years, and so you have to get security data in. It's got to be good, and if you're automating, it's all live. And so when you are talking dollars, you're talking dollars on a day-to-day basis. And the senior management tends to like that.
Yeah, and that's the gap in the current GRCs. Back to Paul's original question, like the frequency. Paul, we used to do these like once a year. We're talking like now you can pull in results, even on a daily basis, would be like leaps ahead of where the industry has traditionally been in an annual type of assessment.
That's right. Yeah, and getting that that data in fresh is really more and more organizations want to do it that way now.
Yeah, and I can tell you it's super impactful sitting in front of a group of senior executives or a board of directors when you can say, when you're presented with a question and you can say, as of this morning, here's the answer. Or, hey, wait a minute, and you check your mobile device and say, here's the answer as of 1 minute ago.
Right. It is much more powerful. And, just the data validity and the data quality, it's, when you're dealing with an assessment that's 6 months old and you're, trying to make decisions based on it, no one's very comfortable.
Yeah, no one's comfortable. And look, the environment that we live in today, stuff is changing so fast. We can't be relying on even 3-month-old data, let alone, annual data. I mean, think about all the changes that have happened in the last 8-9 months. And think about all the risk changes and impacts that every business has had to face. Real time has to be the way to go in this space.
It has to. And the time really is now for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, Jason, any more questions for Padraic while we have him? I could go on all day, but I also want to make sure we stay on time.
This could be a half a day exercise here, but no, awesome stuff. Love it, Padraic. I'm liking what I'm hearing from Cybersaint.
Yeah, good stuff. Thank you, Padraic.
Thanks for having me.
Padraic, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly. To learn more about automating your cyber risk and compliance, please visit securityweekly.com/Cybersaint BSW. We're going to take a quick break and then cover our lessons learned from 2020.